All right, we're looking at the next method of fair division, and it's called the method of sealed bids, and this is 3.5. So here's the steps. What we're going to do is each player, everybody we're trying to divide the estate between. Maybe I'm going to think of an estate like for this problem. So all the siblings or whoever's splitting the estate, what they're going to do is they're going to look at everything in the estate. So maybe a car, house, piece of jewelry, grandfather clock, whatever family heirlooms there are. And then everybody's going to secretly bid on each item. They're going to put a price, what they think the value of that item is. And they're going to keep that secret from everybody else. And then what's going to happen is the person who bids the highest on that item gets that item. And they're going to go ahead and we call it the first settlement. We're going to fair share for each player. So here it is up here. So, you're going to calculate a fair share. And now in this method, a fair share is different for each player because they put a different value on every item in the estate. So someone who felt like, wow, I really wanted everything that grandma owned, they put really high prices on everything, then their fair share is going to be really high. You might be thinking, well, yeah, I just put the highest price on everything, then all my share is going to be huge. But you'll see that if you price everything high, then you might pay the high price for something, which is not what you want, So, everybody's going to list a price on all the items of the estate, and then they're going to add up all of that, and then that's going to be the total price of the estate for that person. You divide by the number of people that you're splitting it between, and then that's going to be a fair share according to that person. Okay, and then if the total value of the items to a player exceed their fair share, that player pays the difference back to the estate. So maybe if they thought, oh, well, that car is worth $250,000 to me, then if their fair share was only $100,000, then they're going to owe $150,000 back to the state or back to the estate, If the total value of the items to a player are less than their fair share, that player collects the difference in cash from the holding pile. So if a player has to pay back the estate, then that cash goes back to the holding pile. Well, if their brother got something that was not their fair share, something of lesser value than their fair share, then they will be paid back cash. It's happening. Okay, then step number 4 is they're going to divide the estate cash, the holding pile, surplus equally among all players. And the final settlement is who gets what. Darn. Sorry about that. Okay, then the final settlement, we just sum it up. Who gets what, valuable items like the jewelry or the house, or who gets whatever. And then also what they're going to have to pay back or whether they're going to get money back. Okay, so let's see an example. And I took names from this class to help us, to help you guys make it more real for you. Let's say that Destiny, AJ, and Margaret are using the method of sealed bids to divide among themselves the 4 items they commonly own. The following table shows the bids that each person made for each item. Use the method of sealed bids to determine the final settlement. All right. So, this is how Destiny bid. Now everybody wouldn't know this. Of course, it's a secret, and like, a third party would come in and they would be able to see this, and they would reveal it, I guess, all at once. So Destiny, she thought the couch for her was worth $715. The recliner was $320, and the desk is $290 in her mind, and the dresser was $90. AJ thought that the couch was $705, but the recliner was $205, the desk was $310, and the dresser was $110. Margaret thought the couch was worth $580 to her, the recliner $345, the desk $400, and the dresser $170. So the first step is we're going to allocate the item to the highest bidder. So who bid the most on the couch? It looks like Destiny did, right? Because now what I'm doing is I'm going across from the couch, the row, and I'm seeing which number is the largest. And 715 is more than 705, and 700 and 580. So Destiny is the winner of that couch. So I'm going to write each person's name and the things that they get. And then the recliner, who bid the most on the recliner? Margaret bid the most on the recliner. And actually, before I go too far, I think we want to make more space down there. I'm going to make more space, so I'm going to move these down. I might even move them to the side. Or I'll just move them down. Then who gets the desk? So they have 290, 310, and 400. So, and Margaret also gets the desk. And then we look at who bid the most for the dresser, and Margaret also, we look between 90, 110, and 170. The highest number along that is 170. So Margaret also gets the dresser. Okay. Now we're going to add up the value of we're going to calculate what a fair share is for each person. And then we're going to calculate how much they got and then and then we'll go on to the next step. So I add everything for Destiny. So we add 715 plus 320 plus 290. All right, so I rearranged it and I put everything on the side just because I want the totals to be down here. So I apologize for changing it. So we're gonna add so 715 plus 320 plus 290, and I'm just gonna use my calculator to find that. So you can just go off to the side and find that on a calculator. Okay, so what I did is I added all the numbers seven in Destiny's, all of Destiny's bids on all of the different merchandise. So 715 plus 320 plus 290 plus 90 was 1,415. So that was her value of the entire estate. And then I had to divide that by 3 because there's 3 different people that we're trying to split this up between. So her fair share, when I divide 1,415 divide by 3, I get 471.66. So that's a fair share in her mind. Then I did the same thing with AJ. I added 705 plus 205 plus 310 plus 110, and I got 1,330. I divided this by 3, and I got 443.33, and this is a fair share in AJ's mind. Then I added 580 plus 345 plus 400 plus 170, and I got 1,495. I divided that by 3, and I got 498.33, and that's a fair share according to Margaret. So now what we do is we're going to tally up what each person already got, and then and then figure out, did they get their fair share or not? So in the first settlement, Destiny got the couch, which had a value of $715. AJ got nothing. So that was $0. And then Margaret got she got the desk. I wrote it over here, the desk and dresser. Oh, and recliner. I'm sorry, I didn't put, gets desk and recliner. So those together are, the desk was 400 plus the recliner, which was 349, which was the dresser, which is 170, and I add those together. Which is 915. Let me just add that one more time quickly. Okay, so it's the 345 plus the 400 plus the 170. So she got 915. All right. So we see that both Destiny and Margaret, they received more than their fair share. So this is Destiny's fair share was 471. She actually received something that was worth 715. So we're going to subtract those, and I did a larger number from the bigger number. So I just do 715 minus her fair share, which is 471.66. So she owes $243.34. And now AJ, he's owed. They owe him $443.33. Then Margaret, she owes, and I take what she got, the 915 minus her fair share. So it's 915 minus 498.33, and that's 416.67. All right. So what's going to happen is that we're going to look at the holding. I think, what do they call it? They call it the holding pile. So these people are going to pay that much. So we're going to receive 243.34 from Destiny, and we're going to receive 416.67 from Margaret. And then we're going to add those together, and that's how much is going to be in the holding pile. So that gives us 601 cents. Okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to use that money from the holding pile because we owe AJ. We owe him, right? Destiny owed, so she already gave that, and so did Margaret, but we owe AJ. So we subtract the 443 that we owe AJ. And make sure when you're doing calculations on your calculator on your phone, which I'm doing right now, I'm just using my phone, you have to press equals. A lot of times I add things up and I don't press equals and I just keep adding or something, like, or dividing or whatever. And it only divides the last number I input, not the sum of the numbers. So you have to press equals. I feel like I forget to do that quite a bit. Oh, wait, did I? Let me see. 660.01 minus 443.33, and I get this 216.68. Okay, so this is what happened is we gave, let's say we gave, Dusty back her money. I'm sorry, we gave AJ back his money, and Margaret and Destiny, they gave the money they needed to give. And now we're still left with $216 surplus. What are we supposed to do with that money? So they take that money and they divide it by 4. And they just reallot it to everybody. Wait. So then everybody gets plus $54 because this is $54.17. Because that was kind of just like they split up equally whatever they had left in the holding pot. I'm sorry, why did I divide that by 4? There's totally 3 people. Well, gosh. I'm glad that I kind of double check that. You kind of have to stay really alert and double check things at each stage, I feel like, because so it should be 72. Sorry about that. are probably thinking, well, why did she divide that by 4? It's actually by 3 down here. I apologize. It's gonna round out to a third. And okay, so then everybody gets $72.23. So now we're kind of do this final settlement. Kind of summarize everybody what they get and what they owe, the money they owe, or so Destiny gets the couch. And what we're actually going to do is she owes 243.334. I kind of mentioned that she kind of already paid that, but she didn't, let's say I just did that in advance so that so that we could figure out how much everybody will be owed later. But let's say she didn't actually pay that yet. So she owes this, but then she's going to get $72 back in. So we're going to subtract these two numbers and say that she owes, and because the larger of those two numbers is the owing number. So we're going to say that she owes that much still. So I'm going to do 243.34 minus 72.23, and I get $170. So she's going to owe $171.11. AJ, he didn't get anything. No material items out of the way. But because we owe him 443, and we're going to owe him for his equal share from the holding pile another 72, that's going to be, we're going to add those two together, 443.33 plus 72.23. So it's 500. We're gonna I'm gonna say nothing but gets $515. And then Margaret gets the desk, recliner, and dresser. And because she owes $416 and she's going to get $72, she's really going to owe only, I'm going to subtract the two numbers, the larger from the bigger, so the larger from the smaller. So the smaller number from the bigger number. So 416.67 minus 72.23. And she's going to still owe $344.44 to the estate. So that is our final settlement. If we wanted to, we could just double check that each person did get a fair share by adding up, all of the values of the things they got, plus if they are getting cash back, like AJ, plus the cash back he gets, or if they're owe money, then minus the money they get, and we'd have to make sure, double check that that was in fact a fair share in their eyes. So like the couch was $715 minus the money she owes. So $715 minus 171.11 is $543.89. So she really received $543.89. And that is larger than her fair share of $471. Then, as you see, AJ's a little bit easier. He gets 515 cash. He thought his fair share was just 443, so that he's probably happy with that. Then Margaret, she gets value. She gets $915 value of items, and then she's going to give back for $344. So it's 915 minus the 344.44. And that's $570. So she actually got her fair share was $498. She might need to get something worth value of $498 or higher, but she got something worth $570. So every person here got above their fair share. So this is the fair division. And everybody's happy. All right. Oh, okay. Yeah. And then so you can write all of this out nicely over here. So I could write they get so you could rewrite everything in here. So I went ahead and filled out all of that in the chart for you. Okay, then we go on to a second example. In the second example, instead of everybody wants these things and we're handing out positive things, we're thinking about chores. So we have three roommates. Three roommates have 2 jobs to complete before getting their deposit back when they move out. They will use the method of sealed bids to reverse auction the jobs. The table shows the bids each roommate made for the chore. Describe the outcome. So instead of we're looking for the top bidder, we're actually looking for the lowest bid, right? So roommate A says, I'm willing to clean the apartment for $30 and then clean the carpets. To clean the carpets, if you pay me $66, I'll do that chore. Okay, then roommate B says I'll clean the apartment for $41 and I'll clean the carpets for $70. Then roommate C said that she'll clean the carpets for $33 and then she'll clean she'll clean the apartment for $33 and then her carpets for $60, right? So instead of handing out to the highest bidder, we're going to hand out to the lowest bidder. So looking across who would be the best if we're going to hire someone to clean the apartment, who are we going to hire if they all do the same good job? So obviously roommate A, because they are willing to work that chore for the least amount of money. So we're going to give roommate A the job of cleaning the apartment. Then clean the carpets. So the person who will do that for the least amount of money is roommate C. And of course, when they were discussing all of this, it's the method of sealed bids. So they put the price they were willing to pay to do each job, as a secret, so nobody else could see it. Okay. So then we hand it out. So roommate A, and I'll write over it, and I'll worry about this. I'll do totals. So we're going to do the same process as before. The total roommate A, the cost of the chores for her in her eyes was 30 plus 66, which is 96, right? And then for roommate B, the cost of doing the chores in total was $111. And the roommate 3, the cost of those chores was $93. So a fair share of completing the chore, if she wants to complete the chores and do her fair share to complete these chores, we're going to take each number because there's 3 roommates and it needs to, the chores need to divide up equally between 3 people. We're going to divide each of those by 3. To calculate the fair share. So 96 divided by 3. All right, so then I figured out the fair share, according to roommate A, was $32. The fair share of roommate B was $37, and the fair share to roommate C was $31. That's the cost of doing those chores. So roommate A, they're going to go ahead and clean the carpets. So okay, I'm sorry, clean apartment. And that is a value worth $30 to them. So that means they didn't really do their fair share of the work. So they are going to owe the rest of everybody else $2, right? Because I'm sorry, they're going to owe $2 to, we'll see, the holding pot. And I found $2 by doing her fair share minus the work that she did. And then she didn't do enough work, if she said she owed people $32, that's what she believed. It was her fair share of the work. She only did $30 worth of work, so she owes people $2. Okay, then roommate B did nothing. So he owes $37. And then roommate C cleaned the carpets, which was worth $60 in her mind. So her fair share was 31. If we do 31 minus 60 minus 31, that's 29. So we owe her. She receives $29. All right, and so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna calculate the money in the holding pot. So we're going to, roommate A is gonna give us $2 to the holding pot, and roommate B is gonna give us $37. So 37 plus 2 is $39. And then, so that's what is owed to the pot. Then the pot needs to pay roommate C 29. So I subtract 29. And then that leaves $10 that's leftovers in the pot. So there's 3 people. They divide that $10 by 3. And that's $3.33. So we're going to go ahead and add that back. So this is the holding pot leftovers. Or share from the holding pot. So that's plus 30.33. They're going to receive $3.33. And this one's going to receive $33.33. So then we see a final settlement. This is kind of our first settlement here was the who did what, but now we're seeing a final settlement. So he owes $2, but he's gonna receive $3. He owed $2 to the pot, but the pot owed him $3.30. So we're gonna subtract those. Okay, so for the next guy, roommate B, he owes $37 because he didn't do anything. And then he he is going to receive $3.30 back just from extras. So I'm going to subtract that 37 minus 3.33. Because one is like he's getting and the other one is owing. So that's why I subtract just the bigger number from the smaller number, or I subtract the smaller number from the bigger number, and then I'm left with $33.67 that he pays. And then the last roommate is going to clean the carpets. And then they're going to get $29 plus another $3.33. So they're going to have 30, they're going to collect, not pay. They're going to collect or receive $32.33. And that's the final distribution here. So we can fill this out.